Hey everyone, I'm joined today by Rebecca Davis, the founder of Practice Sales Advisor. She is a certified exit planning advisor and so many more things. Rebecca, welcome. So good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Rusty. It's always fun when we get together.
Well, I always appreciate learning from you as we talk. I always pick up something new every time. Well, let's get right into it today. We work with veterinarians together, and there are a lot of veterinary practice owners who think they know the value of their practice before they talk to you. They may have an idea in their head. It isn't always exactly dialed in where they maybe think it would be after you've done all your work. Could you start off by sharing why it's so important to even know the value of a practice, years maybe even before you sell?
Absolutely. Practice valuation, I always say, is the foundation to anything that you're going to do in relation to, retirement planning or selling. I mean, it serves so many purposes. So it's absolutely essential to know, of course, the value of the practice, but also ways that you can improve, right, before you sell.
Right.
And then also, is your sale, ensuring that it's viable,
Hmm.
that the practice is viable to sell. And then additionally, we want to make sure that we're planning ahead of time so things are structured properly by the time you get to the closing.
So that ties in, I guess, with the next thing I was thinking about is hear people say, "Well, I'll worry about the valuation when it's time to sell, and then I'll figure it all out then." I don't think that's the right thing that you'd recommend to someone, is it?
No, because at that point, it's too late, Rusty. It's too late at that
Mhm.
at that juncture. A lender requires 3 years of
Mhm.
financials. So you have to think like right now we're September, right? We're trucking along this year. So they're going to use 3 years from the previous financials of the practice. So it's going to be too late at that point because we're always running 3 years back, right? So at that point, if you just wait to do it until that point, then it's mute. We can't go back. We can't improve things. We can't change things. So the sooner that someone does a practice valuation, they're going to be much better off, allowing them the opportunity to improve things and see what it's worth. Additionally, the practice valuation also lets you know your timetable.
Mhm.
Some practices take 6 months to sell, others take 2 years.
Mhm.
So they may call or think, okay, I'm ready to sell. Well, just because the client is ready doesn't mean that, it's going to happen that quickly. It takes 2 months once you find a buyer
Mhm.
to even close the sale. It can
Right.
take 60 to 90 days once you even find it. And then, of course, marketing and getting everything prepared takes a great deal of time. Typically, we work with our clients years out.
Mhm.
Um, so it's definitely something that they'd be well advised to plan well ahead.
So have you seen an example where that valuation done on time, well ahead of time, really made a significant value in the life of that practice owner? Maybe encourage somebody else out there with that.
It makes a difference every single time.
Mm.
Every single time. I've been doing this for 21 years, and I've never seen a perfect one, right? Like
Right.
everyone that comes across my desk, there's always something that you can improve. Um, a lot of times veterinarians share, that they went to school to practice medicine to not do business.
Right.
So a lot of times it's overwhelming for them as a practice owner to wear all of the many hats that they have. And running the practice is just hard for them. They're not familiar with accounting or bookkeeping a lot of times. They know enough to be dangerous, right? Because they have to. But often they'll tell me, like, hey, I'm just on a wing and a prayer. I'm just trying to get by and do the best that I can. Also, they don't have a ton of time to devote to it. So when
Right.
you do the valuation, it's always beneficial every single time because it's always going to point out things that they didn't know. Um, even how the business is structured, right? How their real estate is held. Also, how they align with different benchmarks.
Mm.
How their practice is measuring up compared to others. Um, And no two practices are the same. That's why it's not like a one size fits all in relation to those benchmarks, because the valuation is a full forensic analysis of the financials and the practice as well. You have to take everything into account. Maybe they're staff heavy and doctor light, or vice versa,
Mhm.
right? So you have to look at it all in the entire scope, right? Not just one expense category. So I think that that's important as well. So every time that I've done a valuation, I've always been able to point out it's typically a handful of things, 3 to 5, usually main big ticket items that they could focus on that could greatly improve. Um, and not only, the value, but also their cash flow and earnings in the meantime, right?
Right. I know that as exit planning advisors, we really like to see that value building because it not only helps the profitability, but also the multiple on the end
Oh, yeah,
on that profitability that somebody's able to achieve. And the staff is better, the whole practice is better. If all those things are better, it's going to command a higher price whenever they do go to market, no matter who they sell to. I know that with things like Chat GPT, maybe some veterinarians would think, well, they can just go and Google it and figure it out. And here's a couple of numbers. But there's so many things that aren't even financial that go into this full picture that you mentioned. Share some of the non-financial parts and maybe even some of the odd things that you found along the way that are, and there's some you share with me that are a little bit entertaining.
I always say I should write like a coffee table book, right? The things that,
Mhm.
that I've come across through the years. There's a lot of things that are not necessarily tied to the financials. The bookkeeping itself, right? Oftentimes I'll see, they have one office manager one year, the next year it's somebody different, and then you've got somebody else, and they're all categorizing things extremely different every year. So what that does in relation to the valuation is there's a ton of inconsistencies. So
Mm.
when I look at that, it's hard to get a feel, right, for what the practice expenses really are. And then also when an underwriter, looks at that with a lender, through a lending perspective, they too, aren't going to feel as comfortable with that practice because of those inconsistencies with the bookkeeping. So that's one example. It's not about the numbers; it's about how you're recording them. Um, so it does. It all really makes a difference.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned how it looks to a lender, and somebody's thinking, "Well, I'm not borrowing; I'm selling." But on the other end of that purchase, most of the people who are buying practices from a practice owner, they're having to go get financing somewhere. Maybe speak for a second about the role that the bank plays and how important it is to have everything right for that bank that's going to be financing the new purchase.
Absolutely. It's kind of a running joke in my office, but I always say the bank makes our world go round, right? Because we have sellers and we have buyers, but without a bank, that's the glue that puts it together, right? So
Right.
everything that I do in the valuation scope and in my consultation with clients afterward, explaining the valuation, is all with perspective of the lender, right? What that underwriter is going to say and how it's going to be viewed from their perspective. Um, it's all about a bank. Fortunately for us in the veterinary space, we are very blessed that funding is readily available for vets to buy practices. So that's great that we have that. We don't have a lot of owner financing like we see in other industries.
Hmm.
Um, so with that, we need to be mindful, and the valuation needs to be ideally done with that perspective in mind. Um, so, I always say the bank is the boss of us.
Right.
We do everything I do is for that purpose.
Right.
So to kind of get into a little bit, we'll just kind of touch on the details of the practice report. But first and foremost, it uses 3 years of previous financials because, again, that's what a lender requires, right? So For example, if a corporation, right, or a PE group, or if they're looking at a practice, they only look at a trailing 12-month P&L. So just the most current financials and only 1 year back. But when selling a practice to an individual, um, that's going to use the 3 years. So 3 years are included, but then additionally, what's included in that is when I'm going through and looking at the seller discretionary earnings and EBITDA, excess earnings, however you want to call it. Everybody has different terms.
Right.
We're going through and making those adjustments, but the report also contains footnotes for each of those that give a lot of insight as to the practice and how it's run and why, right? Like a
Mhm.
list of doctors and who works there and when. Things that you just don't find on a P&L or a tax return. So I always tell my clients it's kind of like I'm preparing in a way to go to court, if you will.
Yeah.
I'm getting all of my exhibits basically in order. So that way, when the valuation goes to the bank, the underwriter can clearly look at that. They can look at the financials, and then they have the reasoning and the additional insight right there at their fingertips, which makes everything so much smoother for both parties. So even though the seller doesn't think like, oh, I need to worry about the bank, you absolutely do need to worry about the bank because um, they have to have this information. So that's, a job that I take, a great deal of pride in is providing them everything that they need um, and able to provide funding, to get approval to that buyer.
And I know all banks may have general guidelines that are the same, but they have a little different personality among them. And working with someone who doesn't just do the appraisal, but also places those practices for sale, you probably learned a lot about the differences with the different banks that are out there available to the purchaser. Anything on that you want to touch on?
Absolutely. I feel like almost every practice, almost in a way, there's a perfect fit for a lender
Hmm.
for it. And that's just according to the structure of the sale, right? Is it real estate heavy? Is it real estate light? What I mean by that is how is the real estate value in relation to the practice value? And then just how much is goodwill? How much is intangible? It also depends on where we are currently in the economy, where interest rates are. Each practice, each valuation requires different things. It's different. They're all very unique. So, with that, the banks can be as well. Even, for example, is it the best interest for the practice to use an SBA loan, right? Or conventional? So even just basic items like that, it's important to really walk through that with the seller so they understand, the intention behind that. And then, of course, with the buyer, so they know what kind of loan product is best for them. There's nothing worse than a buyer going to the bank and trying to get approval and they're at the wrong, they have the wrong fit, right? They have the wrong loan product in the first place. That could be very discouraging to a buyer. You could lose your buyer if
Yes.
they're not properly routed and educated on that.
Yeah. So you mentioned real estate, and I know that's a component, and sometimes people think of their practice as just one thing, but from a tax perspective and how you sell and how you finance, that real estate does matter. I know we've worked with clients who have sold their practice and they've kept the real estate.
Mhm.
Some who have sold their practice and the real estate went with it to the same buyer, and then some where the real estate was sold to an investor, somewhere completely different. Uh, does does it really matter what happens to the real estate, and how do you advise on that?
Yeah, absolutely not. I'm happy to do whatever the client prefers. A lot of times I will run the valuation two different ways, right? If they'd like, this is what it looks like if you sold the real estate, and this is what it would look like if you leased it. And I explain to them the impact that debt service can have on those excess earnings, right? How that
Mhm.
impacts the value. Um, I always leave it up to the client, and then I direct them to you, right? Because that's the missing part that they really need. My job is to help with the valuation and then even the sale possibly. But as far as what's better for their portfolio, right? Is that residual mailbox money a better option? Or would selling the real estate and investing, making that money work for them, is that the better option? But that's your arena. I'll defer to the expert on that one, Rusty.
So when you're looking at a practice owner who's really wanting to maximize the value that they get when they sell, the non-financial factors certainly figure in. But what would you say are the key financial drivers that affect that valuation and then ultimately the outcome in the sale?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, gross, income plays a big part in that,
Mhm.
right? And then also growth. Um,
Mhm.
Not as much from a valuation perspective per se, but from a viability perspective, right? Like, how is the lender going to feel about this? They have a hard time getting excited about a sinking ship, right? If the practice is continuing to decline. So that's why, too, it's important for a seller to get a valuation truly before they're ready to slow down and before it's too late. By the time that they've cut back hours or that they're really burned out, the practice financials reflect that steady decline, which is not ideal. So that certainly can impact it. And of course, profitability, how are they doing in relation to those margins? The valuation is really, based off of that excess earnings figure. So, how are things being categorized? How are those expenses being allocated? What items go into making that profit as large as possible so that in turn can relate to a bigger sale price?
It's funny. One of the things that I've heard people say as well, I've got my tax return, so I know what my profitability is. It's real simple. I have to pay tax on it every year.
Yeah.
And you would say that's not exactly the best measure to use. Tell us some more about that.
You know me too well. We've worked together for a while. Absolutely not. It's not even close. It's not even close. And that's a great strategy. Honestly, I mean, that's part of being a perk as a business owner is not necessarily showing all of that profit right at the end of the day. There are different ways that you can personally take that, whether disbursements obviously or perks, right? So that's the sole purpose of doing that forensic analysis is I go through line by line and I'm looking for any related owner related items that are personally attributed to the owner or even their family, right?
Mhm.
And then I'm looking for any one time non recurring expenses because it's not every year you got to put on a new roof, right? Or repave the
Right.
parking lot. So I'm looking for that because all of those items can be recaptured and added back to those earnings. So even though that's not their profit number at the end or the figure that they're paying taxes on, that is the true profitability of the business or the practice. Even how they pay themselves. I have some doctors that
Mhm.
pay themselves $30,000 a year, and I have some that pay themselves $300,000 a year, right? So that varies greatly. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. You could kind of say there are, guidelines that
Right.
the IRS kind of expects you to fall within. But sometimes, their children's college tuition is paid through the practice. They
Yeah.
have multiple cars. Their wife is on staff. She doesn't really work at the practice. Um, you know, Nannies. I mean, you name it, I've seen it. Mistresses. I've seen a little bit of everything that's run through the practice. And I'm like, not here to judge. I'm just here to add it all back to the bottom line. But yeah, each person, each individual owner runs their practice very differently. So, kind of the job of the valuation is to go through and look at that and make it an even scale, right? To
Mhm.
just because you pay yourself 30,000, the new owner is not going to do that. What is
Right.
the debt service going to be for the new owner? Just because you run your personal vehicle through here, that money would be available for the new buyer.
Right.
Um, Health insurance, anything like that, any personal benefits, retirement. So that's what we're really looking for during the forensic analysis process is to go through and, I always tell my clients, help me help you. I'm good
Mhm.
at leading them. I can see that there's something here, this category is much higher, or we can see, a vast difference, in a particular year, right? Um, so yeah, it's digging through that, which is not fun homework,
No, it's
but it's part of the process, and we're extremely intentional with it. It's when it's your skill set and it's what you do all day, every day. Um, it makes it a lot easier to find those areas, and then I also help give examples, like, hey, is this possibly what you did? And it kind of gets their wheels turning. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. We had trees removed that year. That was $8,000. And it's like, okay, that's exactly what I'm looking for.
right. We want to have that picture that's painted for the new buyer to be as profitable as possible.
Yeah.
Maybe putting my car in there is not the best idea. That makes a lot of sense. So if an owner has their own value in their head, they're
Mm.
everybody's baby is ugly, but mine's the pretty one. And kind of the idea, their practice has this high valuation, and maybe it's way inflated beyond what reality is. How can that really hurt them in the long run?
Oh, absolutely. Um, it can be devastating. It can totally throw the whole deal, because what will happen is, if the seller has an inflated value, and then even if he had a buyer who was willing, right, they're
Hmm.
still going to go, when they go to the bank and go through the lending process and approval, it's going to get kicked back from underwriting.
Right.
They're not going to approve it at that price, which is nice for the buyer, because the buyer knows that they're always protected, in a way. So what that's going to do to that seller is, the bank is going to go back to that buyer and say, look, I know you wanted to pay this, for the practice, and it's what you agreed upon or you were willing to pay, but it doesn't cash flow. It doesn't service the debt. So we're not going to approve you. So when you do that with a buyer, all of their confidence, I mean, this is a huge acquisition for them, right? This is the
Mhm.
biggest thing they're ever going to purchase in their life. A lot of people think, like, oh, a car, a house, like,
Mhm.
whoa, those are my biggest purchases in life. Acquiring a business is so much bigger than that, right?
Right.
So they're often nervous. It's a lot of money. They don't know, they haven't done it before. So when you go and the sales price is inflated, and that lender, corrects that and turns that down, you really oftentimes will lose the buyer. And at that point, it's so hard to
Mhm.
repair that relationship. At that point, they just get scared. They're like, I'm out. I don't want to do it. Now, on the seller side of that, the issue with that, I find, is, if a seller has an inflated value, often at first they'll be very excited, right? Like, oh, my
Right.
practice is worth this much money, and they're on cloud nine, and they think it's great. And then whenever they come to that realization, right? Because that takes time. Like, I've had plenty of people reach out to me over the years. Oh, it's worth this much. And then I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, it's not. It's worth this. And here's why.
Mhm.
It takes them years, Rusty, to come back to that, because, as I always say, you can't unring the bell, right?
Mm.
They
Mhm.
had that number in their head, they were
Right.
excited, and you can't, it's very hard for them, understandably so. Like you said, it's, don't tell them their baby's ugly. When they've got that inflated value, it's hard to come back to those realistic terms. And I often find with clients that reach out, um, it takes years to
Mm.
fix that. It really does. So it's very damaging, extremely damaging on both parts. So that's why I always say valuation is the absolute foundation. It's You have to have a great foundation before you build and before you proceed any further.
Right. Those expectations alone can really get in the way of the hard work that's needed to increase that valuation if you just don't think you have to.
Yeah.
It can be very sobering, a real wake up call when you
It's
realize
sad.
that it's just not going to connect if
Yeah.
you keep going with this. Um, different practices are structured different ways, but probably within the small animal world, small animal is very similar. Large animals probably similar to other large animal. They're very different from each other. Can you give us a little perspective about how valuations and then how practice sales operate in the different categories of types of practices that people
Oh,
have?
yeah, that's a good question. Small animal is certainly more desirable, right? There's more of a longing for that, if you will, right? The vast majority of my buyers are looking for small animal practices.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I don't list or do a lot of large animal practices. We're already looking for a needle in a haystack when you're looking for a vet who wants to own in the state of North Carolina, in the city of, that's grossing
Mm-hmm.
this and making this, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
what I do is very specialized and
Sure.
hard enough as it is. And that those margins just continue to go down when you specialize, not just large animal, but also specialty practices,
Right.
holistic, chiropractic,
Mm-hmm.
specialty, emergency, any of those, it does make it harder. Now, I do work with emergency practices a good bit. I have sold specialty practices as well. But I always go in and let the owner know, if I can take the listing, because I don't take anything that's not viable, right? Because it's taken
Right.
upon contingency. So you wouldn't take something that you couldn't sell. But I let them know it's going to take longer. It takes even longer to find that buyer because we're really having to go through and search, and it's tough. It's hard. So especially if somebody has a specialty practice, they would really need to be very diligent with that. And they need to understand that the multiples with those specialty practices are lower than with your typical traditional small animal practice. There's just not as much demand.
Yeah. You mentioned interest rates a while ago, and you also mentioned uh, corporate buyers who are coming in and so forth. So, an individual who's wanting to purchase a practice versus a corporate purchase and private equity money, all of those things are factors. Can you talk about where the expectations are now with things
Sure.
where they are with interest rates and the appetite of private equity and large corporations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if this is going to be dated, that's kind of hard, right? Because if
We're
they
in
do,
we're in the fall of 2025 at this recording.
they can cut that out later if it's not applicable. But right now, typical terms are around 5.5 to 6% interest, depending on, of course, the strength of the buyer, the deal, the lending institution, and just you know, everything else that's attached to it that I have no control. But I'd say 5.5 to 6.5 is pretty average, right? Right now, as far as interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, of course, that's not as applicable to PE, right? So, when selling to an individual buyer, we're always aware of the lending terms and the interest rate.
Right.
But private equity, they have their own backing, so it's not as applicable in that. Also, the differences between the multiples with the two different scenarios. So, a corporate buyer or PE, they don't need funding, right, like an individual does. But then also, they pay a higher multiple. So in our industry, the multiples typically, historically, have always ranged for an individual sale, a 3 to a 5.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to the bank and, an arm's length transaction, an individual selling, an individual buying, a doctor, 2 doctor, 3 doctor practice, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's your typical scenario. Um, just a fun fact, most businesses, average businesses that sell anything from a car wash to a daycare to um, anything, that you can think of. The typical business multiple, fun fact, is usually around a 2, 2.5
Mm-hmm.
multiple. So we're very blessed in our industry, and those multiples are industry specific.
Right.
Like
Right.
HVAC's really hot right now. Dental
Mhm.
had a lot as well. So it just depends on the industry what those multiples look like and what the profitability typically is for that business. And I think that that drives it along as well with demand. But now going back to the PE side of multiples, those multiples on average typically start around an 8. And my last two recent sales were 14s. My highest ever is a 19.
Hmm.
I think those days are gone. I was pleasantly surprised to bring a 14 to the table on the last two recent closings. I would say probably on average 8 to 12 would
Hmm.
probably be more of where we are now.
Hmm.
But I mean, ask me next month, Rusty, it could be
Right.
totally different. So, we're just along for the ride. Um, but yeah, it's wild how those multiples can vastly change. And that's another reason why it's a great idea to get a practice appraised, because I can share insight with that. And I do oftentimes on the report, like, hey, if you sell to an individual, the multiple looks like this. If you consider if you're selling to corporation, it looks like this, to give them a range. That way they're kind of educated and they know where the market is for now. And then they're able to make great decisions based on that.
So let's imagine that you have a doctor who has their own practice, and so a good staff, a few staff, associate veterinarians working for them and things. And they're listening and they're going, okay, okay, okay. 5 years from now is kind of what I was thinking. I'll get around to it. And they call Rebecca and they get their appraisal, and you come back, and are they good till for 5 years, or should they be refreshing that
Yeah,
appraisal as they
absolutely.
go?
Absolutely. I kind of did something unique in my industry. I offer free annual valuation updates because often I was hearing from clients like, okay, we want to sell it. We want to sell it in 5 years. We'll get it appraised now and then we'll, update it then. The only reason that they weren't updating the valuation every year is because they didn't want to have to pay for it, which I
Mhm.
understand. Like, that's expensive and kind of why would you do it every year? But it's absolutely instrumental. All you're going to do each year when you update it is you're just going to further educate both the seller and the buyer. And I
Mhm.
love it, even though it's a lot more work. And like I said, I don't even charge you for that. I
Mhm.
love it because my clients, by the time that we get to that finish line at 5 years, they are so comfortable. They truly understand the scope of it. And it's very powerful when you get to spend that kind of time with the numbers, with the benchmarks, with management, with accounting. It's such a blessing and it's such a head start for that buyer. It's also nice for the seller because they can ensure that they are getting as much value for the practice as possible. There's lots that they can do in the interim, to raise that practice value. So that's helpful as well.
So we now have the information to know we've got to get this done. We're persuaded, we're motivated, we're excited about it. So I'm going to have a valuation, and I'm going to have it updated every year, just like you said. We've got it all done. 5 years from now, maybe even 10 years from now, I'm for sure going to sell. Is there anything else that I need to be doing after this valuation that can really help me within my practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know what I find a deficit a lot of times, Rusty, is when a client either they don't have a team or they
Hmm.
haven't aligned or connected their team. So I think
Yeah.
that would be really beneficial if they could do that prior to sales time, just like the valuation. So their wealth
Right.
manager, connecting that you with the advisor, with their CPA, with
Right.
their attorney, or if they need one, because that's going to also point out where there's gaps or where there's, they don't have somebody advising them or helping them. So
Right.
that would be exceptionally beneficial if we get that A team together. Like we've got to do a lot of deals together, and because of you and I working together, we both can attest to, oh my goodness, it makes the world of difference by the time we get to closing.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I know that I was just talking with a couple yesterday that own a practice, and they're looking towards getting really, really close. And one of the things that they shared was, I'll just kind of anonymize it and say, well, we know we need an attorney, and we have one because I think they did the closing on our house, maybe. And so sometimes when you build a multi-million-dollar business, you've outgrown the team that you started with, and you may need to find some specialists in that area. And I know that you are a great specialist within your space. I think that's great information.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Good advice for
And
sure.
we both have a great referral network because of all of the professional accreditations and things that we have. We have a great network that we can also refer them to if they don't have somebody. So that's
So,
helpful.
so now this person is very educated and for right now motivated. They know that they need to go ahead and get a valuation so that they lock in their idea of what that future could look like for them 5 years out. Let's say plenty of time to maybe address some things that you see. Um, who do they go to? How do they get a hold of you to start that whole process?
Well, I would love to help them. I'd love to help everybody out there. It's a joy when somebody calls and we get to meet a new client. Um, I think just but all that set aside, it's really important that they look for a vet specific appraiser. I think that finding a vet specific appraiser is really important, regardless of who you go to.
Right.
That's what I would tell any buyer. Just like we have vet specific lenders, right? Which that
Mhm.
totally makes a difference in relation to those terms and viability and getting approved and getting the best rates. It's also important to find somebody who's vet specific in relation to getting the valuation done.
Right. Uh, it's not buying a car dealership. It's not buying a commercial real estate company. It's very, very uniquely different, and it's a wonderful and special industry, but with its own subtle nuances that make it its own for sure. Rebecca, this has been such a help and an education and a delight to be with you. Anything as maybe a final thought that occurs to you that would help people out?
Hmm. I think just really the importance of evaluation to build the timeline, to plan properly for retirement, to ensure structures and entities are correct, and also just to give that peace of mind, that you're not going to be rushed and you're going to have this information, you're going to have time to contemplate it, you're going to make a well educated decision. I think having that ahead of time is just going to help the process so much. I don't think that a client would ever regret, getting educated quicker. That's always going to be a vast improvement and a benefit to them.
I think if I could add something to that,
Mhm.
I would also say that in the families that we've been able to serve, that you have served as well, they see that having a confidant alongside them in that process not only gives them the education they need, but it also gives them the confidence to know that they have somebody who's in their corner, who's looking out for them, who's knowledgeable, and who really can see the things that maybe they wouldn't see that could trip them up or could be opportunities. And that's an extra value that I know that I've heard people say that you bring, and that is a blessing for sure.
It
Rebecca, thank
is.
you so much.
And it's an honor to get to walk the journey with them. It is, but having that peace of mind is so helpful because it's a very emotional and
It
complex
is.
transaction. So I think having that peace is just makes it so much smoother and such a more enjoyable experience for them.
Rebecca, thanks for spending time with us. I sure appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Always good to catch up, Rusty, and I'll see you next month at the conference.
I'll see you there.